Um, in Yugoslavia, Hitler was not planning to invade. He wanted to have a pact with Yugoslavia, an agreement. And the king at the time, who was the acting king, he was holding the position for his nephew, who was considered too young to take it, signed the pact. He was trying to avoid war, and the Yugoslavian people would have no part of that. So they turned out on the streets. They refused to go to work. They picketed. They had signs. They wanted war and not this agreement with Hitler. And so Hitler had to delay going into the Soviet Union. He had to deal with Yugoslavia first, and that was very early on. So by April 1941, the Germans are boots on the ground in Belgrade, where my family was. And so what happened was different. There weren't camps yet. They didn't have that system set up. Auschwitz really wasn't a death camp yet. And so what happened in Serbia, like what happened in some other places in Eastern Europe, was much more local. Jews died where they lived. And that's much more my family's story. It's part of why I wrote the book. People don't know this other part that's also important.
Hello, I'm John Brink, and we are podcasting on the Brink from downtown Prince George, British Columbia, Canada. And for all those people from around the world are saying, okay, we know where Canada is, and then British Columbia is on the west coast, right? Right. And it has this big, beautiful city called Vancouver, and we are 500 miles north of Vancouver. And for you, Julie, looking behind me, it's snowing. And
Yes.
so British Columbia, Prince George, northern British Columbia, it's a beautiful, beautiful area, living in nature. It's a small, relatively small community, about 80,000 people, 120,000 in the region. And we have lots of forest, we have lots of lakes. Within 50 miles of Prince George, we probably have 100 lakes and lots of other friends in nature. Black bears, grizzly bears, moose, caribou, you name it, we have it all here. And I call it paradise. And for anybody from around the world wondering about it, no, we will not become the 51st state. That's not going to, and our premier is not called governor, he's called Premier of Canada, and so just to tongue in cheek a little bit. So today we got a very, very interesting guest. Her name is Julie Brill, and she is a biography and author, and she is also the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. Is a deeply personal story, which is a deeply personal story that is a true story of author Julie Brill's father and her family. It explores not only her family's experience, but it is a heartfelt story of family loss and legacy. She wrote a book about it, and she will tell us all about that. The interesting part about me and Julie and her parents is I was born in northeastern Holland, about 10-15 minutes from the border with Germany, in 1940. And so it makes me 84 years young. And but I do remember the war, and in fact, I remember a lot of it still affected by PTSD, the inner child, and a number of other things, and saw far too much of things that we should not have seen. And to add a little bit of family history to it, my mom and dad were married in 1938. And were in love, and everything was beautiful. He had a job in a lumber company, and so they had rented this beautiful house, and fairly quickly had two children, a boy and a girl. And then my mom was pregnant with me. I was born November the 1st, 1940, and then a dictator by the name of Adolf Hitler decided that he should take Poland or a portion of Poland. And then after he invaded Poland, he decided to invade in Western Europe, including Holland. And so my dad, then the young family, everything changed. And so my dad was then drafted into the Dutch army, and for 5 years, they did not know if he lived or died. The last time they saw him was just before the bombing of Rotterdam, when he was seen downtown Rotterdam. That killed thousands of people. And the reason that Hitler decided to bomb downtown Rotterdam is because they, in his opinion, did not liberate or did not capitulate quick enough for him. So he thought to bomb this big, massive city, the downtown, would be a way of convincing them to capitulate. From there on in, it was war, and the first things that I remember was when I was 3, right up to the time of 1945, when we were liberated by the Canadian Army as part of the Allied forces that landed in the summer of 1944 on Normandy, the United States, and particularly in Canada and other countries, that then started liberating Europe and from the dictator Adolf Hitler. And so the Canadians came from Normandy through France, through Belgium, through the western part of Holland, and pushed the Germans back out through northern Holland, where I was born and where I lived. And I still remember it well, as I was about 4.5, 5 years old. So that kind of is a little bit of my background. Yours is amazing in regards your connection to your parents and who were Holocaust survivors, and you will tell us all about that. And then for you to write a book about this experience, and it's right behind you, Hidden in Plain Sight, is the book that you wrote about it, and you will tell us all about that. So Judy, I want to give you a little bit more of the background of my introduction, and so that you have an idea of where was I and how am I connected.
I so appreciate that. First of all, just thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here, but I didn't know that background, and I just know how much the Dutch suffered. In my day job is I'm a childbirth educator and a lactation consultant, so we talk about that hunger winter that the Dutch went through because there's such great Dutch records and what happened with the babies that were gestating then and what happened to them their whole lives, you know, in terms of having that early setback prenatally. So that was just fascinating. I could just talk about Holland all day. That's not why we're here, but I really appreciate hearing that story. I know when the Canadians came in, they thought that Amsterdam had been bombed, and it hadn't been bombed. It's just the Dutch had to take it apart for firewood, large parts of the city. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and let me just add a little bit to that, because I believe this is important. It's not it's indirectly and directly related to your story. Is that because I was there? I remember, as you indicated, the 1943 when the Allied forces decided to bomb the infrastructure of the German war factories, and I remember then with us as kids living in the northeastern part of Holland, 10, 15 minutes from the border. My mom would take us out on the flat roof behind our house at nights, not because it was so pretty to see hundreds of planes flying overhead, a sound that I still, even as a kid, still remember now. And the reason that she felt safer outside than inside. And in the distance, we saw the sky being red of cities burning, like Wilhelmshaven, Emden, Hamburg, Kiel, and all those. In the distance, the sky was red. And then the other part that I remember is that, as you already alluded to, is that in 1944, the Germans cut off all the food supply to Western Europe and particularly Holland as well. And so as kids then, the three of us, my brother, my sister, myself, we would go every morning with gunny sacks to the railroad yard, pick up anything edible and burnable. And
Yes.
so and obviously thousands and thousands of elder people that were vulnerable and young kids died as a result of that. And then that was followed by, that was the hunger year really, and then it was followed by the coldest winter on the record in Holland. And I still remember that part. We were sitting around at nights in one little room in the house that we had one little heater, and we'd be sitting around that just to stay warm. And so I can still feel, even now, 80 years later, I can feel the hunger still, and the cold, and then the anxiety that went with it, and subsequently still, even still today, still have PTSD and got counseling actually for the inner child in my 50s, very emotional actually. And so I want
Yes.
to share that in the context of your story, is that, and we saw far too much that we should not have seen. And I
Yeah.
believe that is important,
Yeah, it's very similar to my father. So my father was born in 1938. He was in Belgrade in Yugoslavia, and he shared with me from when I was very young his very early childhood memories. And I mean, I think some kids don't remember, but sounds like for you and for my dad, it was so vivid. I mean, the details that he remembered, you might not even remember things much more recently, but those core memories just stay with you.
They
Yeah.
and so the other part that about in my case, that there are not so many people left that were then, like I said, I was born in 1940. And so, what I do now is that since the time I'm in Canada, I've been in Canada now for 60 years. And every year I talk to at least 2 or 3 different schools, tell them about, why the silence, the 2 minute silence, what in the Remembrance Day, as to why it is important and how quickly life can change and take all the things for granted that we have, and overnight it will totally change and never be the same again.
Yes. I'm so glad that you do that. I think a lot of the history I learned in school was like kings and generals and presidents, and what you really want is like the voice of some regular person on the ground, what it was like for them.
Yeah, I've been doing that for about 10 or 12 years, and I intend to do that
Yeah,
as long
thank
as I
you.
can. I think it's very important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I agree.
So, Judy, so let's get back to your uh, parents or your dad. They were born in Belgrade, and is that where they were born?
So it's only my father. My mother was born here in Boston.
Right.
But yes, my dad was born in Belgrade in 1938. His family were Jewish and they lived in Dorchel, which is the Jewish quarter, the Jewish neighborhood in Belgrade. His earliest memory, he's not even 3, is the bombing, the German bombing in
Yeah.
April 1941. It's a surprise. That, there's no declaration of war. The Yugoslav people are not expecting it, and they think it's an air show at first. They don't know what's happening. And my father remembers running through the streets with his mother to a bomb shelter, and he remembers the sound. You alluded to this a little bit, John, like the sound of the bombs, that
Yeah.
whistling sound.
Yeah.
And that's his first memory. And what he shared with me was that he didn't remember, like, the city was decimated. He didn't remember that. He didn't remember the days they were in the bomb shelter. He remembered coming home, and my grandmother, for some reason, put a plate of cookies on the wardrobe when she was leaving, and the plate had come off with the bombing and shattered just in two
Right.
even pieces. And my father, as a 2-year-old, was like, I dropped a cup once and it broke. Like, wow, how is it just 2 pieces? Like, that was the amount of destruction that he could think about. And I
Right.
remember thinking about that from when I was very little. It was like I could see it. It was almost like I had been there,
Now, just for
just
background
collecting
a
these.
little bit,
Yeah.
Belgrade is part of Yugoslavia. In fact, it's the capital of
Yes.
Yugoslavia. Just
Yes.
for the
Right.
people
So
watching us, that and it's in Eastern Europe.
yes.
So yeah, and it's closely
The,
related to the surrounding city or countries are Hungary, the Poland is in close proximity, Bulgaria, and
Romania.
Romania.
Yes.
So yeah, so just for location, and so
Yes,
the
and it's of course a city that doesn't exist a country that doesn't exist anymore. It's split
no, not
into
as
numerous.
yes,
Yes,
and so
yeah.
the so tell us more about your grandfather. He was too. Is he still alive or is he?
So this is my father. My
Yeah, your
father was
father,
born in
right?
1938.
Yeah.
Yes, he is alive and well. He lives down the street from me. I see
Oh,
him all the
lovely.
time. Yeah, so he's very excited for the book to come out. It comes out April 23rd. So, it's all of his stories. I think maybe he never thought it would be so public, but here we are sharing the story.
I think it's beautiful. So his whole family was there, and obviously they so they started in Hitler started invading. Step one was Poland, and then
Yes.
moved further east towards the other countries, and then one of the objectives was to eliminate the Jewish people and take them to concentration camps, which were Auschwitz comes to mind, but there were numerous other ones, probably up to 30, 40 different concentration camps in not in Central Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and including Holland and the other locations where they brought the Jewish people, and then from there on in a lot of cases, were moved to concentration camps, and then did not survive that usually. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, up to 6 million Jewish people died during the Second World War as a result of Hitler.
Yes, yes, that's the number that we have, 6 million. So the history where my father was, what's now Serbia, is actually a little bit different than what you just said, which is the understanding that people have of the Holocaust and the camps and the cattle cars and the gas chambers, terrible, all the parts of it. Um, in Yugoslavia, Hitler was not planning to invade. He wanted to have a pact with Yugoslavia, an agreement. And the king at the time, who was the acting king, he was holding the position for his nephew, who was considered too young to take it, signed the pact. He was trying to avoid war. And the Yugoslavian people would have no part of that. So they turned out on the streets. They refused to go to work. They picketed. They had signs. They wanted war and not this agreement with Hitler. And so Hitler had to delay going into the Soviet Union. He had to deal with Yugoslavia first, and that was very early on. So by 1940, April 1941, the Germans are boots on the ground in Belgrade, where my family was. And so what happened was different. There weren't camps yet. They didn't have that system set up. Auschwitz really wasn't a death camp yet. And so what happened in Serbia, like what happened in some other places in Eastern Europe, was much more local. Jews died where they lived. And that's much more my family's story. It's part of why I wrote the book. People don't know this other part that's also important.
So what they did then, just take that a little bit further, is that Yugoslavia, now Serbia, but Belgrade then. So what they did is they entered into an agreement between the king in waiting, if you wish, and the people didn't approve that. So then the Germans moved into Serbia, but not in support of the king, and that
Right.
allowed them to start extracting the Jewish families or create that sense of occupation with the resulting scenes that you
Yes.
describe in the
Yes.
book.
Yes, so the Yugoslavs themselves got rid of their king, this acting
Right,
king who had made the pact. They
right,
put in the young king,
right.
and that's why Germany bombed. That first memory that my father has, and Hitler's just angry. There aren't any military targets. He's just bombing civilian targets. He bombed the library. He bombed the zoo. He knows where the Jewish quarter is, so he extra bombs that, and that's where my family is, and that's what they were dealing with. Once they came in a couple weeks later on the ground, one of the very first things they do is they round up the Jewish men and boys, teenagers, including my grandfather and my great uncle, and put them to work as slave labor. And so
in
we were able
in
to uncover that in the research.
in Germany, and they did similar things in Holland. Although a lot of the Jewish people either went to work camps or from there and into concentration camps like Den, Auschwitz, and others, and would likely not return. And plus, we had several concentration camps in Holland.
Yes.
So that was invaded by the Germans in May of 1940, and they controlled it until, in our case, we were liberated by the Canadian Army that was part of the coalition of U.S. and other countries and Canada. On April the 12th, 1945.
Yes.
So
And you remember that moment.
oh yeah, very
Yeah.
much so. And I was
Yeah.
only 4.5, 5 years old, and
Yeah.
I remember that's always the amazing part about it, Julie, that you likely have as well with your dad. I remember the planes and hundreds of planes overhead. I remember because my dad, they didn't know where he was for 5 years. They thought they didn't know if he died or survived the bombing of Rotterdam. And so she was on her own. And although there were other people around her, but everybody had the same issues they were fighting with, get by on a day-to-day basis. And so what will happen to children of young age that I have from my experience, still have now, is that the anxiety, you can feel it in the one parent that you feel as a young person, even 4 or 5 years old, or 3 or 4 or 5 years old, that if that person dies in a setting like that, then you're all alone, and you likely will not survive either. So that anxiety stays with you.
Yes. Yes. I can see that. Those are your formative years. Is the world a safe place or not a safe place?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So go a bit further about your dad. So that's what happened. So he was sent into a work camp. So what happened then from that point forward?
So it's interesting. In Belgrade, what happened was the men immediately had to report for work. We know from research that I did, I found a street pass that my grandfather was doing sewer repair. So the bombing did many kinds of destruction, but it destroyed the sewer system. There was not a working sewer system in the capital city. So he had been a clerk. He worked at a desk indoors. Now he was working, digging ditches and laying pipe 6 days a week. But the unusual thing is he came home at night. So he had to report for work with the street pass, he and his neighbors, other Jewish men in his street, but they came home at night. And that arrangement went on from April to around my father's first birthday in August. And then one night he doesn't come home. And my father remembers that as well. My grandmother was pregnant and she was just screaming. Of course, she thought that he was dead. Her husband was dead. No phone, can't curfew, can't go outside and talk to the neighbors, didn't know what had happened. I mean, a little bit like your mom, John. And then what had happened was the men were being held in a camp in the center of Belgrade. Now, Belgrade's the capital of Yugoslavia, which was quite a large country. Belgrade is the capital city. In the center of the city is this camp. So people are going back and forth. They're going to football games and they're going to work and they're going to the movies and they're walking back and forth in front of this camp. The camp was a terrible place, of course. It had nothing. So there's a letter where the Jewish community is begging for straw. Could the men have straw to sleep on so they don't have to sleep on the ground? And the Jewish women in the community had to bring food. And so for my grandfather, that was my grandmother doing it. She would walk to the camp and she would bring him food and she would get a glimpse of him. And that went on for months. So he was being taken out to work during the day. He was coming back at night, and it was right. It was not hidden in any way. Um, in November, my grandmother goes to visit and bring food, and the camp is empty. The gates are open, and my grandfather and all the other men have just disappeared. And again, she doesn't know what has happened, but the rumors were they had moved them for work to work elsewhere for the Reich. And that makes sense. My grandfather is in his early 30s. You know, he's young, he's still relatively healthy. Of course, they moved him somewhere else. And my grandmother really held out hope her whole life that, you know, he was coming home again, that he had been moved and he would return.
Wow.
Yeah.
So where
We
did
know what
the
happened. I mean, we have the records.
so what happened?
So the Yugoslavs were very resistant to the occupation. There were
Yes,
actually two armies fighting the occupiers, the Germans. There was the King's Army and there were the communists, the partisans, and they were also fighting each other.
right.
The Germans had a rule that every time a partisan shot and injured a German soldier, they would kill 50 civilians.
They did
And
that
if
as
the
a British.
soldier was dead, they would kill 100 civilians. So that's what they were. These men, including my grandfather, was held in reserve. He was shot probably the day he disappeared. Um, we know the location. It's in Belgrade. It's right in the city. He never left his hometown, buried in a mass grave. And when we first went to Serbia in 2017, we went to these locations and you would not know what had happened there. So there was not a sign on this camp. There had been a sign, the Jewish community made a sign, the sign was stolen. Later we went another trip, there was a sign, but the first time there was no sign, just an overgrown lot. Dogs are walking around, stray dogs, and these two crumbling buildings. One is a auto parts, like a repair store, and one is people are living there. They're squatting, and that's the camp. So if you lived in Belgrade, you would still be walking by. Now you really wouldn't know what had happened there. And the place where the civilians were executed and buried, it looks like a park. It's just green expanse. There's, you know, no markers with names on it. There is a sign what happened, but no names, no sense of, you know, what had happened. I mean, it just looks like a place you would walk your dog or throw a frisbee.
Is that still so today, Judy?
So there is currently, I believe, we were there in 2022, and this was true then, a small sign at the camp, not that you could see from the road, but if you went in there, you would be able to see with some information about what happened. But the Serbian government has been very slow to recognize what happened. There, until we started working, there were no names of individual victims. That's not true anymore. We were able to get information in about my grandfather and other victims, but um, very, very reluctantly, I would say, on the part of the government.
So then the your grandfather, your father at that point was still young, born in 1930, August of 1938. And so when, then, so he was still 6, 7 years old, together with your grandmother, I presume, at the time. So what happened there? They then so when did the war, or when did the Germans uh, uh, they gave up, or they to the Russians, I presume, that
Correct.
liberated.
The Red Army.
The Red Army liberated then Yugoslavia, and now Serbia in Belgrade then, and took over, and then the German or the Russian army pushed further westward towards Berlin, and then that then created the Germans more or less capitulating, and
Right.
Hitler committed suicide and died, and so that was the end. But what it meant also is that Yugoslavia and subsequently Belgrade and the other regions became part of the Russian controlled region uh, to relatively recently, really. with when they took down the wall. I forgot now exactly what time when it was, but
Yeah, 1989. That I do
1989.
remember. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
It's
yeah,
I mean, I think all the history is interesting. Belgrade is the only city that liberates itself. So as you said, the Soviets, the Red Army come and they come up to the outskirts of the city.
right.
My father is living with his mother, and also by then, my aunt, his younger sister, had been born. And he remembers that, watching them come in. There was a railroad that ran along the farm where they were, and the German soldiers were hiding in the tunnel. And I never knew my grandmother, but my father said that she said when they came out, they were smoked out. Oh, they're just boys, because by then the Germans were sending young teenagers to the front. And
Yeah,
I just think about like the humanity of that after everything that they had been through, this sympathy that my grandmother still had for these, boys, these young boys so far from home. Um, Russians, the Soviets stopped at the entrance, and the partisans actually liberated their own capital. It's the
yeah,
only city where that's the case.
yeah. That made that unique, and so
Yes.
then what happened to your dad and his sister and your grandmother? So what happened then next? So they liberated. So I presume that was around somewhere in 1945.
Yes. Yes.
And,
So the Allies are bombing. Belgrade's the only city that was bombed by both sides. So now
yeah,
the Allies are bombing. The war is over. Tito, who headed the partisans, is now in charge. So
dictator.
Dictator, yes. Yugoslavia was and was not behind the Iron Curtain. I mean, Tito was kind of doing his own thing,
Yeah,
but it's communism.
yeah.
My grandmother takes her children back to the apartment where they lived in Dorchel in the Jewish Quarter, hoping that her husband is going to return. And they're living there now with strangers because under communism, your apartment is too big for you. And so and there was a lot of movement of people and people needed housing. And that's where they were, until they left for Israel in 1948. They were either there or they lived in the Jewish Community Center, which was also very close by.
It changed everything.
Yeah.
It would never be the same again. Not
Yes.
even
Yes.
now, and even with your
Yes.
dad very, very much on his mind. And so Yugoslavia and now Serbia and Belgrade now gone as Belgrade, but still there, in the areas where some of these horrible things happened, and the same in Europe, rest of Europe. But I remember of Holland, the Jewish people were removed, dragged out of their houses, more or less, and so were able people that were maybe able to work, Jewish or non-Jewish. And then my family was very much involved in the underground fighting the occupiers, and the results were usually brutal if they got captured. I had an aunt, a sister of my mother, that was very, very active in the underground. Very small, petite lady. She's now passed, but she used to carry weapons underneath her skirt through the
Yes.
German lines. If she would be captured, she'd be shot right there, right
Yes.
then.
Very brave.
And
Yeah.
and so I like is not the right word, but it is so important to speak about this, and your book is so important because there are, what I'm troubled by is that, as somebody that grew up during this time, and as you do indirectly through your father, still alive, and your book is very important, that saying this is what can happen, and this is the result of dictatorships. And if I look around the world and I look at where we live in North America, we are so lucky and so fortunate, although I'm somewhat troubled by some of the things that I'm seeing, that remind me of how it all started in Western Europe with Hitler, that took control over the German government, more or less, and somehow was endorsed by all these people. And how can one individual manipulate a whole population with the result of, as a result, not only of what happened to the Jewish people, 6 million of them were killed, and so were others that were selected, and we stood by and did nothing, and not spoke up the way we could have or should have. And then I look now around the world, I look at Russia and Putin, that is doing, in my opinion, to the Ukraine, but it reminds me of what happened then in 1938 and 37, before that, in taking over control. I look at places like the Middle East, all the trouble and the challenges, Iran in particular. I look at North Korea and Venezuela, Cuba to a certain extent, how precious a democratic rule is and can be, and how, at the same time, how delicate it is, how quickly it can go into the other area of what your book is speaking about, what you are speaking about in regards to your dad. My experience is that everything can change, and how
Yeah.
fragile democratic rule is. And some of the things that I'm hearing now trouble me, is that we have leadership in the United States talking about incorporating Canada as the 51st province, or state,
Embarrassing as an
uh,
American.
and,
Just
and and
embarrassing.
and taking over the Panama Canal, taking over Greenland, like it means nothing. And so, in the meantime, I'm not political, and usually I don't talk about these issues, but it's very much on my mind, and there is no better setting to do it here with you and with the book of telling about the real story.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why we talk about history, not because it's a thing that happened, but it's a thing that could happen
Yes.
again. Like why, we say history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. It won't look exactly the same. But what are the similarities? And obviously, there have been genocides since the Holocaust. Talking about it doesn't keep it from happening, but we can't not talk about it. My grandmother was so disgusted with what happened in Europe. She left. Israel became a state in 1948, and she was on the soonest boat she could get there. She didn't want anything more to do with Europe because of everything that had happened. And I think of her going to visit my grandfather in that camp and seeing other people just living their regular lives, other Serbs that she, knew or could have known. Yeah, her colleagues.
So then, what happened with you is that the your mother want to make the connection to now. Your mother was in the United States. Your dad decided to go to. So how did he? So what happened then? After the war is over, things got back to whatever we call, it will never be the same again, and it will not be normal again. So at what point did he decide to leave and go to the United States?
Yeah, so things are very hard in Belgrade in the after war years in terms of shortage and scarcity and just a lot of suspicion. People who was a traitor, who was loyal, people are being killed in the streets. My father remembers that.
I do too.
They leave as soon as they could, as they had the option of going to Israel. Tito was letting Jews leave, so they went. To another place where things were, another war. And my father remembers open sewers, and it just all kinds of just not enough food in the country. My father's 10 at that point when they go. And he went to school and he served in the military. It's compulsory in Israel. And then he came here to the US to go to the university. and he came to Boston, and that's where my mom was. And they met. Somebody gave him my mom's phone number. He called her from a payphone. She happened to be home. He said he wouldn't have called her again. Like that. They've been married. It'll be 60 years in June.
Oh my
And he
God.
wasn't planning to stay here when he came, but
No,
he
no.
met my mom and they fell in love, and he's been
Yeah.
here the whole time.
Isn't it beautiful? So it
Yeah,
reminds me in a way, just to make the connection. I remember with my mom's sister and then her husband that were very active in the underground, and they knew the fear then there was in Holland, same as you said, after the war. A lot of people, and I say that respectfully to others, is that if the war is over, it doesn't mean everything goes back to what it was before. No, it doesn't. It may take generations, if ever.
right.
And then the other part that is always important from my perspective is that the Germans are not necessarily bad people. We became all victims of this dictator, in this case Adolf Hitler, that somehow was able to convince the masses of people that what he was going to do, they wanted to support. We see the same, somewhat similar with Putin. We see the same in North Korea. We see the same in Iran. Let's hope we don't see the same in the United States or in North
100%.
America.
That's the scariest part, is the normal everyday people who became Nazis and then after the war went back to their regular lives again, right? Like, how is that possible?
How is that possible? And then the other
Yeah,
part about it is, I remember my aunt and uncle and many, many other people in Holland, the fear that they had is that the Russians would take over where they had defeated between the Allied forces in Berlin, each one of them, France, the United States, Canada, blah, 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 that the Russians would push forward into Western Europe. And so the first thing they would do is identify, which they already had, identify the underground that had been active and eliminate them. And a lot of
right.
them decided, as your dad did in 1948, when your dad was 10 then, when he decided to go, a lot of people that had grown up and had been active in the underground in Holland, of different ages, obviously, and that may have been in the 20s, 30s, and married as a couple, decided to emigrate to in mainly the United States, but also Canada, and a whole wave
For their own safety.
for their
Yeah,
own safety because they
yeah,
feared that the next dictators that would overrun Europe would be Russians.
yeah, yeah.
And that changed their life to a certain extent, and it's interesting in a way. So I still remember it was devastating to my mother when her sister and her brother as well, and her brother-in-law, and so many people left. I still remember that, and I was only in at that point 8 or 9, 10 years old, and I remember them leaving to under distress of the fear of the Russians coming in and not really knowing where they would go, likely have very little money, and then, as many others did, a number of them, not all of them, but a number of them would always be in the new United States, which was beautiful, or Canada. United States was beautiful for them because it had opportunity, but they never quite climatized. They had one foot still in Europe and
Yes,
one foot in the
yes.
other side. So for me, it was different. When I left Holland, it was in 1965, and I was born in 1940, so I was 24 years old. And the reason that I left is that when we were liberated by the Canadians, it made such an impression on me that my dream was, and that's what I was going to do. When I grew up, I'm going to move to the land of my heroes, Canada. And I
Yeah,
did when I was 24. with the commitment. I would become a Canadian, and I integrated more so than a lot of the other people did that were directly more involved in the war years, and so it always stayed with them, as it still does with me too, and your dad. And it is so important to write this book and to share from his perspective through you about what it really meant, and all the things that are so important to understand, especially in today's
Yes.
reality.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think your story is fascinating. You chose to come here to Canada. That made a difference. You weren't moving away so much as moving towards something.
Correct. And that was the
Yeah,
difference. But
yeah,
still having the other thing that it did for me, as it did for your dad, is that it is amazing how much, I remember planes overhead. I may have only been 3 years old, but how much you remember from that age of 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, and seeing people being shot and people being dragged out of their houses, and seeing wagons or carts with legs hanging out of people that had
yeah,
been shot. Because as the liberating forces came closer to the border with Germany, it got pretty rough. And
yeah. I mean,
yeah,
kids remember. I mean, one of the things that I couldn't understand how my father's story fit into the historical narrative of what happened in Serbia in the war because no one told that story. But as I finally did the research and wrote this book that hadn't been written before about the Holocaust in Serbia, everything my father said was true.
yeah,
So I didn't know what it meant when he was telling me, and often he didn't know the larger story either because he was so young, but it fit into the narrative. Everything, really was true. So that was part of this, the fascinating part of doing the research, and then being able to give that back to my father, and also the research I did on particular family members, things he would have known if things had been normal, that would have passed down from his parents, and instead I passed it up to him. It's been a really interesting experience.
yeah. And that's been so beautiful in your circumstances, that your dad is still doing okay, and
Yes.
and he is now probably 87, 88,
86, yeah, I'll be 87 this
86.
summer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and on the other hand, in my case, I just turned 84 years. I call 84 years young.
Yeah, for
So,
sure.
and and so enjoying the things that I do, but still all of this very much on my mind. And if I watch the news, then I say how important it is to understand what can happen and what will happen in cases like this, and how it will affect everything that we take for granted can change overnight. And that's why
Yes.
for the last 12, 14 years I've done doing presentations. What does it mean, the 2 minutes of silence? Why is it important? Why should you, the people that I'm making the presentations to, a lot of time high school kids and all the other things, I've made presentations with 600, 700 kids, and where teachers say, oh, they will never sit still, they will never listen. You can drop a pin.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I've been in classrooms telling my family's story about the Holocaust in Serbia, and I've had the same experience. I mean, where kids just get engaged. They're looking for something they can almost touch, right? They want to
Exactly.
meet somebody who is related to the story, and that's what makes it so valuable.
Yeah. So where do you go from here? So the book is now hidden in plain sight, is now ready and available.
So I don't know when this will air.
Okay.
What
Oh,
day
this one.
people are listening
Oh,
to it.
okay. This will air today, so we're going to
Excellent.
make available very, very quickly. So
Excellent.
that's what we do with most of our presentations. It will
I
be
love that.
as we presented. So
Okay.
you're my podcast
Terrific.
number 387, where I've been hosting, and then probably I've done another 250 where I'm guesting. And the reason that I say that is that it is the what I call the new media and to put it into perspective. I love podcasting because what it does is I do a lot of presenting as you do, and when I do give presentations, then I may have a couple of hundred people, but a lot of whatever it is, but a lot of times, it takes me 2 days. If it is in the States or somewhere else in Canada, it takes me 2 days to go there and come back. And where with this media, where you and me are sitting here sharing some amazing background from people that lived it, and you wrote about it on as your dad, and me having lived it as well, and sharing that with the rest of the world on a media like this podcast. And what we already know, I'm not trying to put it into saying hurrah, hurrah, how successful John's podcast is. That's not what it is about. It's about how powerful this media is, that we already know that we have 750,000 subscribers on YouTube, which means that in addition to the other platforms that are out there, we probably have 2 million people watching this podcast around the world.
That's
That
amazing. Thank you for
part,
sharing your platform with me, helping me get the story of the Jews of Yugoslavia out into the world. I'm grateful.
it's so immensely important that you did this, and for the benefit of others, to say, do not take it for granted.
Yes, yes. So in answer to your question, today is March 7th. The
Yes.
book releases April 23rd, but it's for pre-order now. We're in Amazon Boycott Week, but there are other places to purchase it as well. You can order it through your independent bookstore, bookshop, Barnes and Noble, all the usual places.
And are you doing an audio of it as well, Julie, or what is the
I
plan?
hope that there will be an audio. There's a ebook, hardcover, and paperback at the
Okay.
moment. And there are pictures there. You can hear the whole story of how my family survived, that was the question that I was trying to answer when I wrote the book. And a little bit about the larger story of the Jews of Serbia. I wrote the book because no one had written the book. The story has really not been told. And that's because there are so few descendants and survivors to tell it. So it really felt like it fell to us to do that.
If not now, then when? You know.
Yes.
And if
Yes.
not
Yeah.
you, then who, right?
Yeah. I mean, it sort of felt that way. I went to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington and
Yeah.
big bookstore, and there were no books on Yugoslavia. That was the moment where I thought, oh, I guess it's me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So now, what else do you do now? Is that you're still coaching, and what are you doing other than obviously the book has kept you busy? The other part I should quickly say, at least from my perspective, I'm also an author. I've done 4 or 5 books, 6 books actually. I'm working on the 6th one, and the initially writing books is not easy.
No.
And
I've heard that writing a memoir is climbing up the mountain of nobody made me do this, and I would think about that every time I sat down. There is something, anything else I could be doing. You have to be really motivated. It has to be important to you.
so I had with a lot of people to me, when I came here with nothing because I wanted to start with nothing, and then the other issue with me is that I was not academically very successful in Holland. I failed grade 3, I failed grade 7 3 times, and a lot of people said, when I failed for the 3rd time, my parents said, "What are we going to do with this guy?" So said,
Yeah.
some people suggested maybe send him to the mentally challenged school. They said, "No, we're not going to do it.
But you've written all these books.
Let's teach them a trade." And
Yeah.
so they at 12 and a half years old, I went to a furniture factory and to become a furniture maker. But underneath in me, I always knew I was just as successful as in all the other ones. Not better than, but no less than. But I kind of felt I had to start over again to find out, who am I? And because I was
Yeah.
different, And it took me 32 years after I came here in 1965, July 1965. I came here to Canada with the dream of building a lumber mill, and I came to Western Canada because that's where all the trees are in British Columbia. And when I arrived here with a suitcase, 3 books, 2 sets of clothes, very little money, I went to the immigration office, couldn't speak the language, didn't know soul, didn't have a job. And so when I came to the immigration office, I couldn't speak English, but I could speak some German. Kind of funny in a way, but you know,
Yeah.
and so I told him what I wanted to do, and he said, I told him I wanted to build a lumber mill. He said, go to Prince George. That's where the opportunities are. So I took a bus, Greyhound bus. I can still see where the bus station here is, about 3 blocks away, and I came
Yeah, you
off
didn't
the
get very far.
yeah, I came off the bus and with my suitcase and you know, my 3 books, 2 sets of clothes, and then I counted my money at least 3 times. And with the dream of building a lumber mill, I had exactly
Oh,
$25.47.
that's what that is. Yeah.
Yeah. But what I did had lots of attitude. I'm always positive, even under the worst of circumstances. I always say tomorrow's going to be a better day. I did that when I was young, and I still do that today. Passion, whatever I do, I give it 125%. And work ethic, I work harder than anybody, and I still do that today. I get up at 5:30 in the morning. I always make my bed. I always think I'm late. And so a lot of people said to me, say, John, you know, it's such an interesting life, but I still did not have confidence in a way, and I still always wondered, who am I? And they said to me, you know, so a couple of things happened. Is by pure coincidence, I picked up a book in a bookstore here, and I was already here for 32 years, had businesses and did all kinds of things. And the book that I picked up was called Driven to Distraction.
Yes.
I didn't know why I picked it up, and in the bookstore, and I opened it, and I wrote in January 1997. I picked it up. It was written by Dr. Edward Hollywell, medical doctor. He's a professor. Has written 18 books. Has ADHD and dyslexia.
Yeah.
So do I. And
Yes.
and so
Yeah.
and so I picked he wrote this book in 1993. I picked it up in January 1997. I wrote in it in Dutch after I read it, saying, "Oh my God, that's me." And so I wrote in here in Dutch. Now I finally know who I am, and
Yeah.
so that kind of changed my life. And then at some point, and I did build a mill and all kinds of other things. But then a lot of people said to me, "You should write a book about it." And you know, and so for the last 20 years, I've started, stop, and then about 6 years ago, when I'm already well into my late 70s, if I don't do it now, it will never happen. So I wrote a book about it, Against All Odds, and it took me
Yes.
80 years to live it. 20 years to think about it, 2 years to write it, and
I
and
love that.
yeah, and then I wrote another book about ADHD, Unlocked. And that's a story on its own. And then I want to show you one more. I'm going to send you copies of these books. I'm going to
I would
sign them
love
for
that.
you because I want to have you
Thank you.
share it with your dad as well. Is that there's nothing more important than age is a number, but quality of life is the most important one. And so I everybody gets a shock in life and they have to kind of change direction. And in 2008, I nearly died of diverticulitis. And my wife is a vegetarian, and I didn't listen quite as good as I should have, although I was not totally abusive, but I started to change my life in terms of diet. Then I did the same as a lot of other people do. At the end of the year, they're going to do this, that, and the other thing. And then the other thing they're going to do is they're going to go buy a membership to the gym. And then 2 weeks later, they can find 100 reasons why they're too busy. And so I got a trainer and started training. And after training since 2009, 6 years later, somebody said, "Hey, John, you ever thought about competing?" I said, "Me, really?" And so I competed bodybuilding and physique, and
Wow.
and came in northern British Columbia and second in bodybuilding, third in physique. Qualified me for the provincials, the same, and then qualified me for the nationals and the Arnold's, and then COVID came.
Yeah.
And now at 84, I'm still training for the COVID again, and I wrote a book about it. So there's a picture of me. I'm the oldest competitive bodybuilder in North America, and living
It's why
young.
you don't look 84. When you said born in 1940 at the beginning, I like, how could that be, right?
Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
reason. So I'm going to send you a copy
Yeah.
of this too. So
Thank
you,
you.
and share it with your dad too. So and then
Absolutely.
and not for the purpose of this. The simply reason that I competed gives me motivation to go to the gym.
Yeah.
But the so amazing story, Judy. What else can you share with us before we go?
Yes. So I hope that people will check out the book. It reads on a lot of levels. So on one level, it's me kind of empty nester. My kids are grown, and I'm finding out my family history and my family secrets. And so if you want to do that, if you have done it, if you know secrets, you want to learn them, it's a book that's like the broad level. And on a small level, it's about me and my family, and there's no family exactly like mine. And what happened in the war? How did my father survive? If you're able to see the picture, if you're watching this on YouTube with the cover, those little two children standing on the street, that's my father. He's about 5, and my aunt is less than 2. We think that was spring of 1943. So here are these two little children, Jewish children, after Belgrade has been declared Judenfrei, free of Jews, but they are standing on the street. And we had that picture in my house. I would look at it when I was a kid and try to understand and ask my dad and look at the picture. How did you survive? And really the trying to figure that out is the story, the small story, the focus story of the book. And that's why it's called Hidden in Plain Sight, because they're, hiding and not hiding. So I hope people will check out the book, follow me. You can find me at my website, juliebrill.com.
Yeah, and your dad's name is
I am Brill.
Hayam.
That's not the name that's his Israeli name that he has here in the US. He was Heinrich before that.
Yeah. So Heiner shared the books with him, and then
Yes.
the other part on the podcasting side, for all those people watching us and kind of looking back at history, if you like what you're hearing from around the world about what happened in those years, and then with Judy's book, Hidden in Plain Sight, very, very important to read the book, listen to this podcast, and then subscribe to my podcast as we try to do, and to Julie's. Subscribe to podcasting and share it with others and like it and comment on it. And it's very, very important. And at the same time, let's realize how precious democratic countries are and how fragile they really are as things change. And we can see that all around the world, in Russia, we see it in North Korea, we see it in Venezuela, we see it in China, we see it in Iran. Let's hope that North America and United States in particular will not become part of that group.
Yes. Yes.
Judy,
Absolutely. It's a message for right now.
and the
Yeah.
message for now. Judy, it was a privilege, and the book is going to be fabulous, and we'll stay in touch. We'll send the books to you. I'll sign them for
Thank you
you,
so much. I
and
would love
then
that.
let's stay in touch.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, John.
Thanks. Thanks, Judy. Take care. Say hi to your dad.
I will. I will.
Okay, take care.